This is Monica Perez, and we are back today with the third installment of our discussion of the book, The Octopus: Secret Government and the Death of Danny Casolaro. If you want to listen to the first two installments, the first one is in my feed, The Monica Perez Show, June 20th, and the second one was posted July 4th, 2024. And if you recall, if you have been following along, the last time we talked, we discussed an affidavit by an Israeli military intelligence arms dealer, Ari Ben Manash, who gave affidavits supporting a lot of what Danny Casolaro was in the process of exposing. I'm not going to start from the beginning, but I just wanted to point out that I did get this book, Prophets of War by Ari Ben Manash, Inside the Secret U.S.-Israeli Arms Network. It wasn't very expensive. I think it was $30. So I'm just wondering if, like last time, we are going to see an incredible spike in the price of that book. So this book went on the first installment, it was $69, and I anticipated that it would go up. And then when we talked last time, I think it was $491. So, and then I realized I had annotated in it. So anyway, I'm never going to sell it, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so this is where we left off. I'm going to reread this little unbelievable teaser, and then we're going to dive in. The body of Alfred Alvarez, shot in the head with a .38 caliber bullet, burned in the desert heat for a day. It sat in a wooden chair behind Alvarez's house in a yard on Bob Hope Drive in Rancho Mirage, located in Riverside County. Police discovered the body along with those of two others, friends of Alvarez. 6 months later, police broke open a door to a condo on Kearney Street and discovered the dead body of Paul Maraska, hog-tied by a telephone cord noosed around his neck and his curled legs. Maraska had strangled slowly as his legs uncurled. 3 days later, Mary Quick, a 63-year-old school teacher and head of the Women's Auxiliary of American Legion Post 509 in Fresno, was killed by a shot to the head as she approached the Legion Hall. Investigators came to believe that all three murders were connected. Chapter 6, Indio. For a time, Danny Casolaro focused his investigation on the collaboration between Wackenhut Corporation and the Cabazon Indian tribe. The clues provided by Reconasciuto, if you'll recall, Reconasciuto was like a boy wonder tech guy who worked on adapting the Promise software for use, not as it was intended by INSLAW, its rightful owners, as a way for prosecutors and police departments to communicate about perpetrators and suspects, but it became a tool of international military intelligence where they hijacked this. They wanted to make the money off of it. These are like members of the Reagan administration, basically, or their affiliates. They wanted to hijack the Promise software, deprive the owner of his rightful pay because it was going to be huge and they wanted to own it. They didn't want to acknowledge his ownership of it at all. They wanted to drive him into bankruptcy. And not only were they taking this and selling it to foreign governments, many, dozens, they were building a back door into it so that the people who sold it, whether it was the US intelligence and its affiliates or Israeli intelligence and its affiliates, that was part of the subject of this book. Robert Maxwell, super spy, he was involved, supposedly. Not only did they get the money for the software, they got to see everything those other countries were gathering about terrorists or anyone they wanted to know stuff about. So the clues provided by Reconasciuto, who then turned whistleblower, Casolaro looked deep into the Cabazon angle and watched the connections branch out. From the theft of the Promise software, the trail led to the October surprise, if you remember that, with Carter and the Iranian hostages not being released, but then being released like the day Reagan got elected or inaugurated. I can't remember. From the theft of Promise software, the trail led to the October surprise to Ed Meese, who I believe was the Attorney General, and Earl Bryan, to the Cabazon Reservation and to points beyond. The connections kept multiplying. Casolaro made plans to visit the reservation, but never did. The Cabazon tribe has only 30 members, making it one of the country's smallest tribes. Its desolate 3.5-mile desert reservation is located near Indio, California, in the Coachella Valley outside of Los Angeles to the Salton Sea's north. The tribe was as destitute as the land it owned until the arrival from Florida in 1978 of Dr. John P. Nichols, a white-haired and bearded Burl Ives lookalike. By the early 1980s, Nichols had transformed the Cabazon landscape into an enormous casino operation, replete with a power plant and housing developments. It became a center for international business, particularly in the weapons and security trade. In his notes, Casolaro calls John Philip Nichols, quote, flaky, beyond a reasonable scope of achievement. He also calls him, quote, a dangerous man. Nichols had been described by others variously as a charlatan and a spook, but a man with an obvious talent for writing successful grants. A Cabazon chairman, Art Wellmus, described the tribe's predicament when Nichols came on the scene. When you don't have nothing and you can't get grants, you're last on the totem pole. Where can you get a start? After Nichols had taken control, Wellman remarked, it's all controlled by outside forces. These poor Indians are brainwashed. They don't want to lose the money they're getting. The origins of Grantsman Nichols' Svengali-like hold over the Cabazons remain as obscure as the job history on his resume. Nichols depicted himself as an expert in socio-health and economic development planning with 25 years' experience. He also cited credentials as an ordained minister and PhD with 20 years of employment by ProPlan International, a company involved in economic development. Other jobs listed on Nichols' resume included stints as a Milwaukee brewer and labor organizer, a mental health program director in Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and a manager of a Coca-Cola plant in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The resume included a number of falsifications and items conveniently left out. According to his claimed alma mater, the Philatia Theological Seminary of the Free Protestant Episcopal Church in London, Ontario, Nichols never earned a doctorate in theology. As a labor organizer, he had been arrested for mishandling union funds and was later picked up on a fugitive warrant. Other facets of Nichols' life also resisted a narrow reading of his background in, quote, socio-health and economic development planning. Although he left the bottling plant after a year, Nichols spent 10 more years in Chile. That comes up. That's an interesting one. Bolivia and Brazil. Although he played a significant role in organizing 2 million Marxist and Catholic voters into the leftist Chilean evangelical church, he later bragged about his involvement in the murder of democratically elected President Carlos Allende, as well as the attempted murder of Castro under the orders of the CIA. Later, Nichols denied that he ever made such statements. He characterized himself as a simple social worker. Nichols also worked at one time as business partners with G. Wayne Reeder, an alleged CIA operative. Reeder was partners with Neil Bush, brother of George W. Bush, and defaulted on over $14 million of debt to the failed Silverado Savings and Loan and San Marino Savings and Loan companies. During their association, Reeder was one of many people who provided Nichols the commodity he needed to succeed as a grantsman: contacts. Among many others, Uganda's Idi Amin and Chilean President Eduardo Frei made the list, and police reports indicated that Nichols had business contacts in 16 foreign countries. Whatever Nichols was, social worker, big money schmoozer, or something else, he quickly took over the management of the Cabazon tribe and began building his empire in the desert. Benefits accrued to an operation based on Indian lands. The sovereign status of Indian land grants certain advantage to investors, including tax advantages, relative freedom from government scrutiny, and the bypassing of legal regulations, such as environmental impact statements, which would be required on non-reservation lands. One of the first schemes Nichols put into action was the mail order sale of tax-free cigarettes from the reservation. This operation employed about 10 Cabazon Indians in a non-air-conditioned trailer. The Indians reportedly made about $100 a week for their work. The cigarette sales succeeded, and within 2 years, the tribe branched out into the sale of tax-free liquor. The state of California stepped in this time, however, and sued and won for unpaid taxes on the liquor. From available records, it appears the back taxes were never paid. Similarly, Nichols' plans for a telethon, an Indian Olympics, the processing of coal, and the importations of gold, and the development of a pharmaceutical firm all fell through, rankling tribal members who charged that Nichols had manipulated tribal factions and brought in non-Cabazons to vote on these operations. Nichols had bigger plans. In 1979, he put together the arms manufacturing partnership between the Cabazon tribe and the Wackenhut Corporation called Cabazon Arms. Wackenhut remains one of the world's largest private security operations and the third largest private prison contractor in the United States. That was as of the writing of this book, which is, what did we say? Like the copyright, Jim Keith, one of the authors, died in 1999. The copyright of this is 2004. So I guess Ken Thomas, the primary author, finished it. Among numerous other operations, Wackenhut has supplied guards for U.S. embassies worldwide, security for nuclear installations and test sites in the United States, and security-related enterprises in 39 countries around the world. Wackenhut is a private detective agency founded in 1954 by former FBI man George Wackenhut and 3 ex-FBI friends in Miami, a hotbed of a rightist political activity at the time. George Wackenhut had important political connections, Florida Governor Claude Kirk and Senator George Smathers among them, and shared a pre-dilection with J. Edgar Hoover for acquiring files on people. His connections helped build his agency into a powerful private police force with huge government contracts. Senator Smathers' law firm hired guards from a Wackenhut subsidiary to work nuclear bomb test sites in Nevada and Cape Canaveral, a workaround to the federal law forbidding private detectives from working for the government. George Wackenhut's preoccupation with compiling files made the agency an extraordinary intelligence resource as well. Investigator John Connolly noted that by 1965, Wackenhut was boasting to potential investors that the company maintained files on 2.5 million suspected dissidents, 1 in 46 American adults then living. In 1966, after acquiring the private files of Carl Barslag, a former staff member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, Wackenhut could confidently maintain that with more than 4 million names, it had the largest privately held file on suspected dissidents in America. I mean, dissidents, what does that mean? Suspected by whom? It's just files, dossiers on 4 million Americans. By then, almost half of Wackenhut's executive staff were former FBI members, 2 of whom had been senior officers of the division in charge of domestic intelligence. Current and past members of the Wackenhut board of directors included former CIA Deputy Director Frank Carlucci, former Deputy CIA Director Bobby Inman, former CIA Director Admiral William Rayborn, and former FBI Director Clarence Kelly. Michael Riconosciuto provided more names in the cast of characters that made up the history of Wackenhut. Robert Jason, this is a quote of Riconosciuto, Robert Jason, who is the group vice president of Wackenhut, has an interesting history. Robert Jason was vice president of International Telegraph and Telephone, ITT, which I'm pretty sure actually have seen documentation that it's a CIA front organization. I don't know what a cutout is, but it's definitely, ITT is definitely CIA. This is Riconosciuto's quote, continuing. During the Allende situation in Chile, Robert Jason was the CIA station boss as well as vice president of ITT for Chilean operations. His deputy station boss was Dino Pianzio, and John Philip Nichols was working under Dino at that time. Jason goes from ITT to Wackenhut. During the Carter administration, Robert Jason is commissioner of U.S. Customs for the entire Carter administration. As commissioner of customs, he has some interesting projects directly out of his office. So the CIA does customs, I guess. Oh, I guess we know why. If you think about it, I think we're going to get to it in a couple of pages. One of them was Fat Albert, the drug interdiction surveillance balloons. So that's what I was thinking, is that why would the CIA control customs? Because they use drug money to fund their operations. And it doesn't work if there's competition. So some get through, some don't get through. Fat Albert balloons were big balloons with radar and other sensors that were doing the aerial surveillance for drug smugglers flying in. So proto drones, I guess. The vendors supporting that project were wholly owned by Earl W. Bryan. You might remember from last time, he was the guy who wanted to really own, control, and profit from the promised software more than anything else. The contracting officer handling all of those companies was Peter Videnix out of the Bureau of Customs. He was the DOJ agent who was trying to strong arm Riconosciuto into not testifying before the House Judiciary Committee. This was a very large procurement, and Videnix's job as contracting officer was to deal with industry. Right. To assist in the administration of Cabazon Arms, John Philip Nichols recruited Peter Zukoski, husband to the mayor of Indio and the previous head of an ammunitions manufacturing company called Armtech, under the impression that Nichols intended to start a similar arms manufacturing operation on the Cabazon land. Zukoski soon discovered himself involved with drug dealers, schemers, contras, and murderers. In 1981, Nichols, Zukoski, and Robert Fry, a vice president of Wackenhut, traveled to Quebec in an attempted $18 million purchase of Valleyfield Chemical Products Corporation, a weapons propellant manufacturer. The deal went bust due to Canadian government objections. The trio then went to Indiana, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., setting up the manufacturing of combustible cartridge cases and 300 pairs of night vision goggles. Zukoski recalls that the goggles, at least, were intended to be sold to the Nicaraguan Contras, and recalls a demonstration of the equipment for Contra Eden Pastora, aka Commander Zero, at a police weapons range in Lake Cahuilla, California. Powerful men were creating powerful schemes on the Cabazon Reservation, and that power could be used to stop those who might interfere with those schemes. Okay, so the Indian reservations were used because they did not necessarily have to conform to federal law, and they were broke. And after trying a bunch of things, Nichols is making it a place for security, arms, that kind of thing. That's where I believe Riconosciuto said he did some of his work on the Promise backdoor. So that's all. So on the one hand, they're selling it internationally. On the other hand, it's happening on the ground in India. All right. In 1982, Fred Alvarez, a Cabazon tribal leader, and 2 companions were found murdered on the Indio reservation. Alvarez had been critical of Nichols and Wackenhut's dealings with the Cabazon tribe, and he had mentioned to friends that he had received death threats. Investigative reporter Virginia McCullough later came to believe that Alvarez had discovered that monies rightfully belonging to the Indians were being embezzled by the partnership called Bingo Palace, Inc. Alvarez knew what he was getting into, however. He had told the Indio Daily News, "My life is on the line. There are people out there on the reservation that want to kill me." I just want to take a little aside here. This was published in 2004. I think around that time or after that time, a really suspicious murder, was it a murder suicide, something like that. And I happen to remember the name of the investigator who was looking into some, I think, cold cases in India. His name was David McGowan, and I remember it because Dave McGowan wrote Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon and the serial killer book and all of that. So his name was a coincidence. But so in 1982 is when this guy was found murdered. And I think more than 20 years later, they were still actively covering it up. It seems to me. I mean, I saw some exposés about the David McGowan thing that were on the local news, TV news. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. Nobody ever brought up these particular murders, but I just thought it could be connected. According to Riconosciuto, Alvarez was present at all the meetings and he was gung-ho behind Nichols and everything that was going on there. Okay? We were all red-blooded Americans and we believed in the things that were going on. The way things were shaping up with the Reagan election committee and the things that were being orchestrated made us all concerned. And Alvarez wrote a detailed letter to Ronald Reagan expressing his concern. All the details of the October surprise hostage issue were outlined in the letter. I mean, in specifics. Okay, so this is Riconosciuto, who people say seems kind of crazy. A lot of his stuff checks out. I assume not all of it checks out, or people wouldn't say he was crazy, but I don't know. Linda Streeter Dukic, Alvarez's sister, described early relations of Alvarez and the inner circle around Nichols as being amicable, but said that when he started objecting to some of the schemes coming down from Nichols and the other tribe leaders, they began to send him on business trips. One trip was to Denver in June 1981 to attend a conference. Streeter says that while in Denver, Alvarez was offered a large amount of money to carry drugs back to Indio, but turned down the offer. When he got off the plane, his sister said, the police grabbed him, threw him spread eagle against a car, and searched him and his bags. Alvarez's mother said that only Nichols and his son were aware of Alvarez's trip to Denver. On the morning of July 1st, 1981, a meeting was scheduled by Alvarez with attorney and former Cabazon chairman Joe Benitez. The intended topic of discussion was how to oust Cabazon control from Nichols. When Benitez arrived at Alvarez's home in Rancho Mirage, he found Fred Alvarez shot through the head as he sat in a chair. Alvarez's girlfriend and another friend were also nearby, shot dead. The murder of Alvarez and his friends took place during a period when Nichols, Zukoski, and a Wackenhut associate named Bob Fry were traveling around the country on munitions business. Zukoski told reporter John Connolly, I felt like they were stalling. We had no meeting scheduled. Zukoski returned to Indio, and the following day, the bodies of Alvarez and his companions were found. The day after that, Nichols returned to Indio. When Zukoski told Nichols about the murders, quote, Nichols seemed unaffected, like he already knew. Zukoski stated that Nichols, quote, dialed a number and asked for Bob Fry. Alvarez has been murdered, he said into the phone a few seconds later. After another few seconds, Nichols said, okay, so long, and hung up. The investigation of the deaths by the police was slipshod and hurried. Police familiar with the case note the friendship of Nichols with one of the investigating detectives. One police investigator believed he was removed from the case because of pressure put on his superiors from the outside. When the investigator pursued further on his own, he received death threats, one from a crossbow-wielding man. Fearing for his family, the man gave up and moved out of town. In any case, the investigation languished until the appearance of Jimmy Hughes. Hughes had been Nichols' Wackenhut bodyguard, and he reported to Indio police officials that he was Nichols' bagman for the murders of Fred Alvarez and his friends. Hughes described Nichols and two of his sons, Mark and John Paul, as having doled out $5,000 in cash in front of him, with orders to deliver the money to two men in the nearby town of Idlewild. Hughes stated that Nichols admitted to me the ordering of the Alvarez murder. He stated there was a U.S. government covert action. Pressures from unknown Washington, D.C. government agencies have caused a possible shutdown of this case. Yikes. According to Hughes, the murderers included several ex-Green Berets employed as firemen in Chicago. Hughes went into hiding in Sonoma and Lake counties after the murders, under the protection of the Riverside County District Attorney's Office and the California Department of Justice. Wow. I'm reading that again. Sorry. According to Hughes, the murderers included several ex-Green Berets employed as firemen in Chicago. Hughes went into hiding in Sonoma and Lake counties after the murders under the protection of the Riverside County District Attorney's Office and the California Department of Justice. The FBI offered Hughes protection under a witness protection program, but he turned it down, fearing, quote, Nichols has made a deal with the FBI through the Wackenhut Corporation. Possibly he himself has been protected by the FBI. Hughes, so he doesn't want to go into FBI custody because they can get at him there, is I think what he's saying. Hughes also stated that the Alvarez investigation had been interfered with by an agency out of Washington, D.C., offering no other specifics. He said, the FBI is small potatoes compared to that agency. What could it be? The NSA? Napa Sentinel editor Harry Martin detailed curiosities about the investigation that followed Hughes' revelations. The chief investigator for the Riverside County District Attorney's Office was later taken off the case and transferred to the juvenile division and then given early retirement. Shortly after his retirement, the DA investigator states that he was pulled off the road one day by a CIA agent and told to forget all about the desert if he wanted to enjoy his retirement. Yeah, this is where I think if you're interested, Google David McGowan. But you know what? You might not even find anything. I'll see if I can put something in the show notes, which will be on monicaperezshow.com. After Jimmy Hughes came forward with information, he left the country, reportedly traveling to Guatemala. Hughes was said to be in possession of documentation linking the men at Cabazon to a hit list of political targets, including Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. I read the 2-volume work by Ole Damigard about this. Let's see. Linking the men at Cabazon to, wow. Palm was murdered in 1986. Wow. I mean, the book does roll out a lot of suspects, and I'm guessing multiple entities were involved. And look at Sweden now. Israeli intelligence agent Amaran Nir, who died in a mysterious plane crash, and Cyrus Hashemi, a key player in the events of October Surprise, was also murdered in 1986. And that was on the list of political targets that this guy Hughes could link to the men at Cabazon. And this is what Danny Casolaro was digging into. The expansion of Cabazon Enterprises continued after the murder of Alvarez. In 1983, the Department of Defense gave the Cabazons authorization to manufacture weaponry. At that time, Nichols also engaged in discussions with Stormont Laboratories, a genetics lab, about the possibility of manufacturing a bioweapons detector. In March 1983, a casino and bingo parlor appeared on the reservation, visible on the left side of Highway 10, driving into Palm Springs. Part of the funding for the bingo parlor came from a $90,000 HUD grant given ostensibly to the Cabazons for the construction of a museum. In 1983, the Cabazon, see, this is what I think is happening. So these guys, they're in with the CIA, whatever. They're doing these things. There's geopolitical reasons, but they're all getting rich along the way, and no one's ever going to look into it for fraud or murder or anything else. And just so when I always ask, like, is it Satan? Is it lizard people? Is it all about the money? Is it this? Is it that? It's definitely both. It's big picture and small picture. And you get these smaller picture guys to do this stuff that foster the larger goals by letting them get rich and leaving them alone and letting them unconstrained do what they use their own tactics. In 1983, the Cabazons contacted La France Specialties, another weapons manufacturer, to seek assistance in building a weapons factory on the Indian lands. A letter to La France said that the weapons intended to be manufactured, including assault rifles with laser sights, sniper rifles with 1 mile plus range, 1 mile, 9mm machine pistols, rocket systems, night vision scopes, and battle communications systems. Danny Casolaro focused on the most grisly of the Cabazon murders in his notes, that of Riconosciuto associate Paul Marasca. Quote, in 1982, the body of 30-year-old Paul Marasca was found hogtied and fatally strangled in his condominium on San Francisco's Telegraph Hill. Marasca, who had been working among the Cabazon Arms confidants, reportedly had the access codes for offshore accounts containing hundreds of millions of dollars in drug money, ostensibly for covert operations. Michael Riconosciuto said of Marasca's death, quote, and then my associate Paul Marasca was found murdered. I was the one who found him. See, I don't know if that's true or not because it says elsewhere that the cops found him. That quote we read at the beginning of this episode. But maybe he did. And Nichols and others tried to keep me away from our condominium office in San Francisco. It was suspicious to me. And after almost 14 days of not seeing Paul, and then a day after he missed a critical meeting that there's no way he would have missed, that's when I went looking for him. And Nichols tried to get me down to the desert on an emergency basis to work on some projects so that I'd be otherwise occupied. And I said that I'd be down there as soon as I found out what happened to Paul. And he was really pushy and really stressed out. When he came across to me on this, it made me even more suspicious. And other people that I talked to tried to dissuade me, and it was just not normal. The amount of pressure and emphasis they were putting on this situation. I knew in my gut Paul was dead. He'd been slowly strangled to death. I don't know if it says it here or if I read it someplace else. The way it worked was he strangled himself to death. So he was hogtied like backwards with a rope around his neck. And if he kept his hands and feet together, he wouldn't strangle. But if he relaxed or fell asleep or anything, he would strangle. And who knows how long it took. But 3 days after Paul Maraska's murder, a woman named Mary Quick, 63 years old, a school teacher and women's auxiliary president of Fresno's American Legion, was headed towards Legion Post 509 when she was killed by a single gunshot to the head in an apparently unrelated mugging. A year after the murder, however, police learned that Riconosciuto claimed a business associate with Mary Quick's nephew, Brian Weiss. Riconosciuto claimed a business association with Brian Weiss. Police sources told the San Francisco Examiner that Weiss gave his aunt a bank card with secret account numbers, perhaps the same access codes that may have led to Paul Maraska's murder. According to the police, she had no connection to any of the principals and could be trusted. Mary Quick was to be instructed to give information only to Paul or Michael Riconosciuto. She was not aware of what the computer card was for and had never even received the card. Riconosciuto claimed that Mary Quick's murderers were probably trying to recover the card. After the death of his wife, John Philip Nichols became involved with a 27-year-old heroin addict. Nichols attempted to hire a hitman to kill his girlfriend's alleged suppliers, but made the mistake of soliciting the hit through a police informant. On tape, Nichols can be heard saying, "I'll pay $500 and $500. For 2 murders. Nichols also made clear that there would be additional work for the proposed hitman. "I need some work done in Latin America. I do a lot of business down there." Nichols proposed that the murderer move to Vegas and not freelance, but work out a guaranteed income. Like he was going to put this guy on the payroll. In January of 1985, John P. Nichols was arrested on charges of soliciting the murder of 5 persons. The case never came to trial. Nichols pleaded no contest and was sentenced to prison for 4 years, although he served only 19 months. The felony conviction forced Nichols' official removal from his job running the Cabazon Reservation. The elder Nichols continued as a mental health counselor to employees and the Indians on the reservation. However, while his son, John Paul Nichols, became tribal administrator. A 30,000 square foot casino and bingo hall were soon under construction, and a deal was cut with Colmac Corporation to construct a $150 million power generating plant on the reservation. Other business dealings by the Cabazon tribe included plans for a 1,300 luxury housing project to take advantage of HUD funding and an industrial incinerator for medical waste. Both proposals would have taken advantage of the fact that environmental impact statements would not be required because of the land's sovereign status, a legalism pointed out by Michael Riconosciuto in his affidavit of March 21st, 1991. An extensive Southern California Edison electrical facility has also been developed on Cabazon land. In 1990, control of the Cabazon Reservation was turned over to John Paul's younger brother, Mark. Mark had served 6 months in jail in Florida for possession and sale of cocaine and LSD in 1978. Also in 1990, a pari-mutuel off-track betting parlor was opened, courtesy of a grant from HUD. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988 made the practice of Indians opening betting parlors and casinos commonplace by the early 1990s. In fact, the act allowed tribes like the Cabazons to buy property outside the reservation, but regulated under the same rules of sovereignty that protected the industrial incinerator and Reconstructo's manufacture of chemical weapons from federal control, creating great potential growth for such enterprises. That doesn't really make sense, although I'm sure our government would like it to, because what they do is they'll suggest that an oil investment in the Middle East, I mean, this is just my little aside, that you should expect the US to be able to enforce our laws on foreign territory. Similarly, there's no reason that the reservation should be able to apply its laws to territory that isn't on its reservation, even if it owns it within the confines of another state. Of course, I'm fine with everybody just owning their own private property and not being part of the state, but it just doesn't seem kosher. Casolaro had a hard time trying to come up with Casolaro began looking into illegal operations connected to other Indian reservations in the United States. He found connections to the Papago Indian Reservation and the alleged shipment of drugs by the CIA and the criminal underground. In his notes on Cabazon, Casolaro remarked, "Guns to Iraq, missiles to Iran, dope for money," with arrows showing that dope money funds the above. So guns to Iraq, missiles to Iran, and dope pays for it all. That is what happened with Iran-Contra. Casolaro had a hard time trying to come up with a title for his unfolding story. He listed several alternates for his manuscript. On the Trail of the Money Catchers, On the Trail of an Unlikely Alliance, On the Trail of an Alliance Gone Awry, Rogue Spies, Big Oil, Organized Crime, and Secret Empires, and The Prophetic Death of the Poet. Each suggested some connection to what he had learned in his research on the Cabazons, struck as he was with its importance to the Insula case. At one point, he considered simply calling the book Indio. Here, I don't normally read the footnotes, but there was one footnote that caught my eye. Footnote 12 from U.S. News and World Report, August 23rd, 1993. It says, in 1980, California's Cabazon Indian tribe hired as their poker room manager one Rocco Zangari, identified as a mobster in Senate testimony. He was subsequently fired. Later, after tribal vice chairman Alfred Alvarez complained to local newspapers about poker room skimming, Alvarez and two others were shot dead. The case has never been solved. Man. Behold a Pale Horse, Chapter 7. Danny Casolaro pulled the various threads he had uncovered together into a book proposal for submission to publishers entitled Behold a Pale Horse. Now, we've all probably heard of, I think it's Bill Cooper who wrote the Behold a Pale Horse that was actually published, I think, in the 90s. I think that was published in the 90s. So who knows? Was that a Google bomb or what? Like meant to drown out this guy or steal his thing? Anyway, there's no copyright on titles, so people are welcome to use the same one over and over again. He didn't realize at the time, but he was describing a part of the interlinking cabal he would later call the Octopus. The following excerpt is from this book proposal. Behold, a Pale Horse will be a haunting odyssey that depicts a manifesto of deceit, decisions of conscience, good and evil, intrigue and betrayal. John Philip Nichols found his promised land just north of Mexicali on the wild grasses above the Salton Sea. He was 60 years old then, and the Cabazon Indian Reservation on the edge of Sonora was an ideal place for him to nurse his secret self. This is vast desert emptiness where the yucca reaches nearly 40 feet high, where the Mormons saw it as a symbol pointing to the promised land, and they called it the Joshua Tree. But the Joshua Tree is an ugly, unsymmetrical lily with burly arms crooked at the elbow, and it points everywhere. Not unlike John Philip Nichols, as if asking itself, what shall I do next? There is a point on the ridge of the Little San Bernardino Mountains known as Salton View, where you are more than 5,000 feet above the desert, and where to the north you can see the great escarpment of Mount San Jacinto. Jacinto? I think I have to say San Jacinto. And to the south, the man-made no, it's San Jacinto. I remember because in Northern Cal, there's I think there's a street named after it. Okay, I'm going with San Jacinto. And to the south, the man-made Salton Sea, the orchards of the Coachella Valley, and on a clear day, Old Mexico. It is always clear in Indio, and with the clarity of the warbler in the cottonwood grove, John Philip Nichols knew that he could bring his box office charity and all his earthly possessions into the reservation of the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians. With no more than 24 Indians and nearly 2,000 acres of desert solitaire, cactus, and cotton grove, the Cabazon Reservation was a suitable home for gambling, dope, dirty money, and gun running, and all the fugitive visions that line the edge of oppression. John Philip Nichols didn't howl under 12 full moons before the gambling was underway, and in the desert night, people flocked from all over to Indio Bingo and to the poker casino at the fork of Highway 10 and Highway 86. Under a major corporation's umbrella subsidiary, later to be named Cabazon Arms, the gun runners and the money traders soon arrived. The weapon makers and the generals from Babylon, conscious resuppliers, covert operatives from both the East and West, and in what one source calls a marriage of necessity, the dope dealers, the mobsters, and the murderers. Man. And he thought they were going to publish it? Whatever John Philip Nichols saw in the dark cathedral of those desert nights in silence and certainty cracked and came unglued. After a number of still unsolved execution-style murders and solicitation for murder charge for which he was jailed, the dark vision of John Philip Nichols eroded. Although he's been released from a short stint in prison, he's a one-eyed jack now since only Indio Bingo Gambling, managed by his sons, the Las Vegas-managed poker casino, the Indians, and the most formidable creatures of the desert remain. That was his treatment for the book he wanted to write. Several of the author of this book that I'm reading to you goes on. Several of the Cabazon Arms associates during the 1980s are coming out of the shadows to take top billing for the actual participation in the $1 million laundered payment to the Iranians to delay the release of the hostages and shutting down the dope and dirty money schemes of Nugan Hand, and resurfacing its activities in assisting Gerald Bull in the refinements and distribution of his weapon arsenal, including his supergun, and in the development of the fuel-air explosive technologies thought to be responsible for the Beirut bomb, which killed 241 servicemen. Wow, that chapter seems to have come out of nowhere. That's a lot of new information. But this is the Iran-Contra stuff and the October surprise. An international cabal whose services cover parochial political intrigue, espionage, the trade of weapon technologies, biotoxins, drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder has emerged from an isolated desert Indian reservation just north of Mexicali. While this cabal continues, its origins were spawned 30 years ago in the shadow of the Cold War. In recent months, however, several of its members have gratuitously taken credit for the purposeful delay of the release of the hostages until after the 1980 election, scuttling and resettling the schemes of the Australian-based Nugan Hand Bank, their involvement with Gerald Bull, assassinated last spring in Brussels, and the development and distribution of fuel-air explosive technologies. Is that like a railgun? Should we read this? I think there's one little. Yeah, there's next chapter's like one page. Let's do it. Chapter 8, Wild Rumors. The facts that Danny investigated astounded him, but the rumors were out of this world, some of them quite literally. Rumor had it, for instance, that the Cabazons belonged to worldwide, quote, reservation operations run on Indian lands by the Enterprise, quote, and Wagon Hut under the project name Yellow Lodge. Yellow Lodge allegedly produced advanced warfare projects, including parthenogenic viruses co-engineered with Stormont Labs in Woodland, California. Stormont Labs later acknowledged that it had discussions with Wagon Hut concerning biological weapons, which are totally illegal. You know, that's why we bombed the crap out of Syria, is we said they had, chemical weapons, but they're both not allowed. And it wasn't true about Syria, by the way. Yellow Lodge ran operations on Jicarilla, Apache lands, and other Indian reservations, including a center called D6 located in Dulce, New Mexico. Danny learned that some UFO enthusiasts identify this location as the site of a huge underground joint human-alien base. Others believe the alien base to be government disinformation intended to confuse the real nature of the Dulce operation. In his notes, Danny mentions MJ-12 extraterrestrial, alleged by the more excitable end of the UFO research spectrum to be a super secret U.S. military group charged with signing a non-aggression pact with space aliens. He also mentions Area 55 and Pine Gap. Area 51. Sorry. He also mentions Area 51 and Pine Gap. Area 51 is a military test site in Nevada for advanced aerial weaponry. Although only through a recent job hazards lawsuit has the Air Force begun to admit to the existence of the base, Area 51 has long been known as the staging ground for the U-2 spy plane, the SR-17 Blackbird, and is much rumored as the home of the post-stealth marvel called the Aurora. In 1989, a man named Bob Lazar went public with claims that he had worked at Area 51, taking apart and reverse engineering alien spacecraft. Although even UFO skeptics acknowledge some consistencies in Lazar's stories, his efforts at documenting his credentials and work history have met with some doubt. Jim Keith wrote Saucers of the Illuminati, where he explains that a lot of the UFO stuff was used to cover up weapons testing by the government, by the U.S. government. Pine Gap is the top secret underground American base located near Alice Springs in Australia, officially known as the Joint Defense Space Research Facility. Pine Gap allegedly serves as the Central American base for the monitoring of spy satellites and interception and decoding of various forms of broadcast communications between foreign powers unfriendly to the U.S. Pine Gap was built in 1968, ostensibly as a means of sharing space program data with the Australians. Opposition to the base grew as it became clearer that it had a more prosaic purpose: espionage. In his 1987 book, The Crimes of Patriots, author Jonathan Whitney demonstrated that CIA manipulation led to the early end in Australia of the administration of Labour Party PM Gough Whitlam, in part because of his opposition to Pine Gap. Indeed, Whitlam was rousted after his public complaints about intelligence agency deceptions over the tragic U.S. policy in East Timor and the CIA's funding of Australia's right-wing Country Party. By a quirk of Australia's constitution, Whitlam was not driven from office by an election, but was removed by a governor-general he had appointed, one who had strong ties to the CIA. No doubt the paranoia about this destabilization of the U.S. ally down under fueled other rumors among locals about the underground Pine Gap base involving alien government collaboration. One early page of Danny's notes seemingly ties together Area 51, Pine Gap, a small Pennsylvania town called Sonoma, and possibly one of its citizens, someone named Fred Dick. Perhaps tracing one of many convoluted dead ends that Danny traced, the authors of this book dispatched an investigator to the Sonoma, Pennsylvania, in the notes. The Sonoma, Pennsylvania, in the notes. Okay, but failed to find Dick even after placing it. I'm sorry, that's a terrible name. Even after placing it classified in the local news. I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. Okay. Even after placing it classified in the local newspaper or any indication of what may have linked him to the two mysterious military bases. Buried in notes written much later, however, were references to Tonopah, Nevada, near Area 51. Fred Dick, however, remains a mystery. Although he had an interest in computers and science, Casolaro's interest in the UFO world began with Michael Riconosciuto. Riconosciuto had a proclivity for flights of flying saucer fancy going back at least a generation. After Casolaro's death, he told one computer magazine that Danny had learned nothing more than what one of two intelligence agency factions wanted him to know in order to embarrass the other faction. One faction was called Aquarius and had a leadership subgroup called MJ-12. Riconosciuto even told one writer that he had witnessed the autopsy of an alien body. The writer concluded that Riconosciuto would have told anyone anything to get out of prison. Interesting. Rumors also had it that Riconosciuto had worked for Lear Aircraft in Reno, Nevada. This connected him to both John Lear Sr., creator of the Learjet, and often claimed by UFO buffs as having done research on anti-gravity for the government, as well as John Lear Jr., a former CIA pilot who also hit the UFO circuit with tales of saucers and aliens in cahoots with the U.S. government. Lear Jr. and Bob Lazar comprise a faction within the UFO subculture that maintains a regular presence at its gatherings. Other members of this nexus have included the redoubtable William Cooper, whose 1991 book, Behold a Pale Horse, shared the title of the first draft proposal of Casolaro's manuscript and became notorious for its examination of Area 51, its reprinting of the anti-Semitic protocols of the Elders of Zion, and its claim that JFK was shot by the driver of his car in the presidential motorcade. To a lesser extent, this nexus also included Gordon Novel, by rumor and confession, a minor player in the Kennedy assassination and the Watergate scandal. Some have suggested that the bizarre tales of extraterrestrials coming from this nexus serve as disinformation to deflect attention away from serious issues such as gun running and black project weapons development. Riconosciuto had his own intergenerational connection to the UFO lore and his own link to the Kennedy assassination. His father, Marshall, had been a business associate of Fred Chrisman, a man involved in the Maury Island incident, one of the earliest UFO incidents to follow pilot Kenneth Arnold's famed flying discs over Mount Rainier in 1947. Arnold, in fact, investigated claims by Chrisman and Harold Dahl that Dahl, his son, his dog, and two others witnessed 6 saucers as the crew boated in Puget Sound along the shore of Maury Island. Dahl's child was burned and his dog killed when one of the saucers spewed metallic debris on the boat. Chrisman and Dahl mailed metal fragments of the debris to Amazing Stories editor Ray Palmer, who hired Kenneth Arnold himself to investigate. Confused by what he was hearing from Chrisman and Dahl, Arnold called in 2 Air Force intelligence officers. They conducted some interviews, collected some of the debris, and were headed back to home base on a B-25 when an explosion on their early morning flight killed them both. What? The Maury Island incident was written off for years as a hoax, but recent research has brought up the possibility that Chrisman used his possession of the saucer debris as a means to a career among the spooks. Flying saucer crash retrieval rumors mounted in 1947 near the Riconosciuto stomping ground in Tacoma, Washington. The Tacoma News Tribune reported upon a retrieval by William Guy Bannister, the FBI special agent in charge of the area at the time. Bannister became famous much later in life when he shared office space with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans, possibly employing Lee Harvey Oswald as an agent provocateur. Chrisman, too, had been connected to Oswald via a subpoena from the investigation of JFK's death by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Some alleged that Chrisman was one of the 3 hobos photographed after their arrest in the railroad yard behind the infamous grassy knoll on November 22, 1963. Chrisman was notably silent about both Maury Island and JFK in his 1970 memoir of life in Tacoma entitled Murder of a City, written under the pseudonym of John Gold. He did have warm comments about Marshall Riconosciuto, however, and recounted that the young Michael had discovered several electronic bugs at his father's office. Whew! This is jam-packed. It actually, I still think it's kind of too hot to handle, which, by the way, I think is the name of Jeremy Kuzmarov's new Substack. But and this is 40 years later? It's chilling. Anyway, next we'll do chapter 9, Pursuit of the Tape. This would be a great thriller if it weren't true, but because it's true, it's terribly tragic. All right. Wow. Thanks so much for listening. I can't wait till the next installment. And I've read this before and my jaw drops. Actually, all of Jim Keith's books are great. So maybe I'll read more. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time. This is Monica Perez.